Hey, how's it going, folks? This is Metaguyson here today, and we are doing another episode of the Mittacast. Um, this time I'm going to be doing this Mittacast alone, and I will be talking about the philosophy of Jacques Derrida and relationship to three topics: one, phenomenology; two, Heideggerian phenomenology; and three, digital technology. So before we go in, I want to say thank you for all of my subscribers who have followed my channel for the last 6, 7 years and supported the cause of philosophy and philosophical analysis, cultural analysis, so on and so forth. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your support. Essentially, without your support, I wouldn't be here right now having this podcast talking about Jacques Derrida. So, besides that, I want to go ahead and go in. So, when we talk about Jacques Derrida, usually what we think about is, post-structuralism, postmodernist philosophy, and this is a kind of continental philosophy that was popularized in the late 60s into the 70s with the works of Deleuze, Michel Foucault, Jean Bouchard a little bit later, um, Roland Barthes. These are just to name a few. To name a few, I'm sorry. And the whole mission statement of these philosophers at the time was, what is meaning? And how do we define meaning? Do we define meaning through, really, do we define meaning through language and narratives? And every philosopher in this era tackle these questions from different perspectives of the humanities. Deleuze was more traditionally inclined in, philosophy, metaphysics. Um, Michel Foucault was more interested in the history of ideals and how the way we discourse about these ideals, like the concept of power, freedom, insanity. Then Roland Barthes talked about how these ideals are created through semiotics, and how these semiotics are created or fostered in the culture and how they shape the social order and so forth. And Jacques Derrida was more so focused about the philosophy of language and how language is understood through history and phenomenology. So with that, you have an ideal of Derrida as a philosophical linguist, a philosopher whose main interest is in language and how we use language to perceive reality and, create the world that we perceive. And, Derrida was very influenced by the phenomenology tradition, and this goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant. Um, Unofficially, he's considered the first phenomenologist. If you read the Critique of Pure Reason, a lot of the arguments that later phenomenologists were used, such as Husserl or Martin Heidegger, was essentially created through, Kant's transcendental method. And, you know, true phenomenology begins in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th, with the work of Husserl and his logical investigations. And in logical investigations, Husserl is trying to answer the question of experience, how we define experience, and how can we break experience away from pure psychologicalism, meaning which that what we perceive in the world is just states of the mind reacting to emotional stimuli. So, Husserl believed that the mind doesn't really work that way, but it's more like a axis of different, ideals and concepts that we perceive reality through to create a worldview. Um, Martin Heidegger comes a little bit later in the 1920s with the publication of Being in Time, which was influenced by Husserl. Heidegger was a student of Husserl, but he had a fundamental difference in how phenomenology should be handled. Husserl was a more scientific-minded, rational-minded guy, and his phenomenological method was essentially a science, and Heidegger thought that distracted away from the mission of phenomenology and what phenomenology should be, which is the study of being itself, being in the world, a subject who's encountering, you know, a world that exists prior to him, but also informs his existence at that given time. So these are the questions that Heidegger raises in Being in Time, which was published, I believe, in 1927. And in Being in Time, Heidegger is trying to basically do a deconstruction of Western metaphysics along with the phenomenological tradition that was established by his mentor in the early 1900s. And through this, he creates this concept of Onto-Theology, which is essentially, Heidegger argues that ever since Plato, there has been a type of understanding of being. And being, like I said, is a notion of being there, being in the world, existence in itself, as a separation of existence, as in ourself within the world and the world itself. And this separation was a dualism per se, a subject-object dualism. This comes a little bit later in the philosophy of Rene Descartes, but the foundation of that ontology was pre-proposed by Plato's philosophy in the 4th century BC. So what Heidegger is trying to do is basically destroy this understanding of being, or more generally, the philosophical concept of ontology. He's trying to destroy this ontology and bring being back to being in the world. So with that, we have an understanding of philosophy, 20th century philosophy, and 20th century phenomenology as a philosophy of experience and how experience is understood. And I want to make a quick emphasis here. The first half of the 20th century, Heidegger's philosophy, experience was understood as subjectivity, a being, an individual who is experiencing the world within the confines of their own understanding of the world, where later in Heidegger's philosophy, this is where Derrida comes in 30 years later, but Heidegger starts the breaks here, or starts the path here in the 30s with their turning, or I believe it was German, Darker, which is, turning away from being as subjectivity and more so being as history, language, specifically poetry and technology. And with this, Heidegger is pinning emphasis on how these phenomena, as I just described, technology, language, and history, truly creates the world, and where being experiences the world in himself, herself, in, the said world. So with this comes in Derrida, and Derrida sees this as a philosophy or the metaphysics of presence, in where, philosophy, and he's taking this argument from Heidegger, philosophy from the age of Plato to his age is essentially a philosophy that is trying to kind of perceive the world as the way the world was perceived as of now, right? So, like, for example, this is classical Greek, classical Greek in the 4th century, the, social / cultural trends of that time, maybe, poli, democratic life, a semi-polytheistic society, because by this time in their culture, they're swinging more towards atheism, but still nominally a polytheistic society, and a society that is really focused on what is happening in the polis at the given moment. So you know, returning back to Derrida believes that this has been essentially, just like Heidegger, the philosophy of Western philosophy up to that, ever since then. And what Derrida is trying to do and showcase through his philosophy is that with his metaphysics of presence, in this privileging of presence, and Derrida says it more specifically in his writings, speech over experience and speech through writing over experience, we start to see a kind of like detractment from things as they are, and a creation of a ghostly image of what things are and what the world is. And this where writing becomes the main means of experiencing the world and being the lens in which the world is presented to us. And in this we have the concept of play. First is introduced in Derrida's philosophy as play, and what play means, or what Derrida means by play, is inherently the system that language and speech functions in Western metaphysics, or like I said, the metaphysics of presence. And with this, you have a constant contradiction, right? And the contradiction is seen through the language itself. So you have the binaries of nature and culture. He talks about this a lot in the essay Structure, Science, and Play, Discourse in Human Sciences, and also his masterwork of Grammatology, in where nature is privileged over culture. Or sorry, culture is no, I said it right. Nature is privileged over culture, and with that we have a oppress of a oppressive relationship, where in reality, Derrida argues, if you look at the binaries, nature and culture, one exists in the other. There's some aspects of nature that isn't in culture. So the binaries themselves are not stable as, traditional metaphysics of presence would like you to think so, excuse me, but they're more disabled. And with this, you have the play of language, right? So he gets this concept of play from Klaus Lévi-Strauss, which was a socialist anthropologist. And Lévi-Strauss talks about in his works in the 50s, the late 50s and early 60s, the concept of bricolage. And bricolage is essentially borrowing of concepts from other cultures. So his context of the use of the word bricolage was a relationship to native cultures in, I believe it was in the South of America or South America. And I'm not sure if he went to Africa, but definitely in South America. And he was seeing that, like a lot of these native cultural myths, where you have like a trope or of some sort, they were not they were similar, but they were not connected. Like these cultures weren't, associated with themselves. They weren't communicating with each other as often. And he learned from this that, like, with the myth also changes from each culture. Not too much, but there's enough change to make that myth unique to the culture that uses it. And he observed, or he deduced from this conclusion, was essentially that what we understand as myth, as like there's a foundational myth, like take for example the myth of Oedipus. Oedipus itself serves as like a foundational myth, in where you have the basic story of Oedipus. He goes sees the Sphinx. Sphinx tells him about his fate. Kills the Sphinx, and later kills his father. That's the basic structure of the myth. But maybe let's say in Thieves, for example, the myth of Oedipus is explained, or is told. The details of the myth of Oedipus are told slightly differently from the myth of Oedipus in Athens. And this is where the bricolage happens. Ultimately, Oedipus itself, the myth, there's no necessarily source myth from this interaction because the myth is always changing, given the context. So from there, Derrida, comes to the conclusion that because the myth, or because bricolage, the bricoling of myth is dynamic and always changing. There's no one true myth, and if there's no one true myth, there's no one true presence, and if there's no one true presence, the metaphysics of Western civilization, which he later calls Phonocentrism and of grammatology, is a metaphysics that is essentially um, a false metaphysics, a metaphysics of absence. And from there, Derrida begins the project of Différance, which is, the trace of speech through language in that constant deferring of meaning through this antinomy or contradiction. Antinomy means contradiction. So yeah, this is the major, um, philosophical crush of Derrida's philosophy from, the 1960s, essentially all his life. He's working on these concepts and he's trying to, um, leave room open for interpretation, freedom, creativity, because he felt that philosophy was too restrictive in this tradition of the metaphysics of presence. And interesting enough, Derrida believed that Heidegger was still inherent in tradition, and he felt that Heidegger's Dasein was essentially a reinterpretation of Hegel's absolute knowledge. And he sought to do what Heidegger couldn't do, which he believed was to deconstruct Western metaphysics as a whole. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about Derrida's concept of the transitional signified. So returning back to Structure, Signs, and Plays, the discourse of the human science, the whole essay is built around the argument of the transcendental signified, because not only that Derrida is talking about, um, language in terms of binaries, he's also talking about semiotics. And semiotics is really the means in which, communication systems, language is a communication system, but communication system as a whole, like sign language, nonverbal communication, creates signs, means of expression to interpret or, to interpret, certain concepts and um, ideals, to other people. And the founder of semiotics or modern semiotics is Fernand Saussure, and Saussure talks about this in his work. I'm trying to remember the name of that book. I think it's a General Course of Linguistics, and in that book he talks about the binary between signified and signifier, and this binary, signify signifier, creates the sign in which, like I said, meaning is conveyed through individuals within society, language, so on and so forth. So Derrida deconstructs that too, and with that he deconstructs. I'm sorry, he deconstructs it. Say that again. He deconstructs Western linguistics through structuralism by breaking apart the signifier distinction, and he's essentially applying the same logic of play to the signified and signifier. Because one thing that Fernand Saussure says in General Cultural Linguistics is that the distinction between the signified and signifier is arbitrary. There's no set grounded meaning between the two. And Derrida takes this and he says that essentially Western metaphysics or Western linguistics, going back to the beginning, this binary, like I said, just the same argument he has with the nature culture binary and bricolage, is unstable. And the transcendental signify this, in which this semiotic binary is referring to, is a observation. It's not real. It's covered up by this endless deferral and this endless arbitrary change of the signified and signifier. So what I take from this in my own philosophy is that essentially what we understand as the transcendental signified. So the transcendental signified in Derrida's time was the postmodern, notion of, or the deconstruction of meta narrative as a whole. There's no absolute meaning. There's no truth. There's no metaphysics of presence, so on and so forth. But what I take from this is that yes, Derrida is right in the sense that the transcendental signified does not exist in the traditional sense that there is a separation between subject and object, spirit and body, God, and the world. But there's essentially, I guess, in the aftermath of this, the signified becomes, the database world that we live in today with digital technology in the internet and AI, and how the way the algorithm works is very similar to how Différance works in Derrida's philosophy, in where the algorithm is always deferring meaning, is always changing its meaning based upon what you put in the search query, based upon information you give the social media outlets through your profile and interactions with social media, which you buy from places like Amazon or like DoorDash, whatever. And with this, like I said, meaning is constantly diverted and recontextualized. And this trace of this algorithmic language becomes a slippage or a disorder of, the database logic of digital technology, which resembles the traditional Japanese concept of Midare, which originates from the story from, I think in the 11th century. It's called Genji Madoto Gore, which is, in English, the Tale of Genji. Is considered the first novel in world history. In that novel, Midare is used as a metaphor for the entanglement of the hair, and when it happens, is a signifying that there is a disruption in the social order. So, referring back to the database and the algorithm, how the way the algorithm functions, and when there is a glitch within the database in the nature of the algorithm, it resembles the entanglement of Mindare. And with this entanglement from Derrida and his concept of play and difference, we have a opportunity to recontextualize the algorithmic knowledge or the algorithmic language of the database and explore possibilities of freedom within the database. Because as it is now, and how the way the AI works, it works in a logic that, kind of presupposes that there's no fix or there's no open system, that everything is closed, everything is calculable, and everything is observed through the algorithm and the algorithms relaying information back to the database. But with Mindare, we see that the database in itself is inherently dysfunctional, and it is not as organized and regimented as maybe a Sam Bankman or sorry, Sam Altman or Elon Musk would like you to think. There is still glitches within the system. We see this in the phenomenon of AI hallucination, where you'll ask the AI or you'll send a prompt to the AI, and the AI will come back with the incorrect answer, or not even necessarily the incorrect answer, maybe like a ballpark estimate of the question that you asked them. Maybe it's you know uh not necessarily on the dot, but around that area, right? So that is a example or a showcasing of Midare in action. And like I said, the reason why I pinpoint this because going back to Derrida and really going back to Heidegger, what do we understand as, being in the 21st century? Being in the 21st century is different from the 20th. In the 20th, we're talking about meta narrative, right? Language, books, literature, and how we construct meaning through these mediums and through this phenomenon. Or I'm sorry, this phenomenon. But in the 21st century, the rules of the games are different. We construct meaning through interface systems that are connected to these interlocking, interconnecting, servers, right? So the world is essentially mapped out or covered through this intercollecting, entangled web of digital technology. And our understanding of being in the world is vastly, radically different from our understanding of being in the world. Or, say even better, the questions that were raised by Derrida and Heidegger are fundamentally different than the questions that would be raised or will be raised for the question of being in the 21st century. So really, it's another way to look at it is not necessarily a transition from, or a critique of the text, right? The tradition of phonocentrism that Derrida speaks of and of grammatology is essentially a critique of language through writing and through writing the book in itself. We're past that. The book has been deconstructed, right? It's been deconstructed, scanned into, the database hard drive and put face forth on the internet for everyone to see and to pull from. So now what we're facing with is not necessarily the cohesive understanding of meaning through the book, i.e., the Bible, Western, the Western literature tradition, but more so, how do we convey meaning through the entanglement of these different, quote unquote, source codes of textual history, and how the text is revived through the digital and understood through the database and AI and algorithm. So that is the podcast for this time. As always, like and subscribe, and thank you for your support, and have a great day.